The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow across the quiet beach. The air was cool, and the waves gently lapped against the shore, a peaceful rhythm that calmed the soul. But something unusual was happening that day. A strange sight caught the attention of the locals. A group of 5 enormous creatures washed up on the shore. Their size was unlike anything anyone had ever seen, their forms massive and white, almost glowing in the fading light. The creatures were completely unlike anything from the land, and their arrival sparked fear and curiosity all at once. At first, the people didn't know what to make of the situation. They had never seen anything like these creatures before. Some thought they were animals. Others wondered if they might be some form of ancient myth come to life. The beings were unlike anything in the history of the small coastal village. People started gathering at the beach, whispering to one another in excitement and fear, unsure of whether they should get closer or stay away. The creature's size was intimidating, but there was also something strange about them, a sense of sadness and vulnerability that seemed to linger in the air. The first instinct of the villagers was to stay back. They weren't sure if these creatures meant them harm. Their sheer size alone was enough to make anyone nervous. But as the creatures began to move, their slow and awkward movements told a different story. They weren't aggressive or threatening. Instead, they seemed exhausted and trapped, as if they were struggling to get free from something. The sight of their large bodies tangled in the sand only deepened the mystery. It was clear that these giants were in trouble, but no one knew how they had ended up on the shore. As people stood by, unsure of what to do, one of the giants let out a soft, mournful sound. It was a noise that seemed to carry with it the weight of something deep and painful. The sound was so unexpected that it sent a chill down the spines of those nearby. It wasn't the roar of a wild animal or the threatening growl of a monster. It was the sound of something lost, something in pain, something that needed help. The locals stood frozen, unsure of how to react. Some were too scared to approach, while others felt an overwhelming sense of curiosity. Who were these creatures? What did they want? And most importantly, were they safe? The beach was a mix of emotions. Fear, uncertainty, and curiosity hung thick in the air. But there was also a growing sense that the creatures were not the enemy. They weren't here to hurt anyone. They were just in trouble, and no one knew how to help them. As the giants continued to struggle, the villagers began to realize that these creatures weren't so different from themselves. They were vulnerable. They were hurt, and they needed help. But what could a group of small humans do for these giants who seemed so much more powerful and capable than any of them? Would they be able to reach out, even if the creatures were so different from anything they had ever seen? The evening grew darker, and the people gathered in a small, hesitant crowd on the beach. Some talked in low voices, while others remained silent, watching the giants with a mixture of awe and concern. It was clear that something big was happening, something that none of them would ever forget. And in that moment, as the giants lay there helpless on the shore, it was hard to tell whether the people would walk away or step forward to help. This expanded Part 1 introduces the creatures and sets the stage for the unfolding events, maintaining the curiosity and suspense. Let me know if you'd like any changes. The giants were stuck in the sand, struggling to move. Their massive bodies were partially buried, and it was clear they weren't able to free themselves on their own. With each movement, they only seemed to sink further into the soft earth. Their pale, glowing skin was covered in sand, and their breathing was heavy, as though every effort they made to move caused them pain. The sight was both haunting and heartbreaking. It became obvious to everyone watching that these giants were not invincible, not the terrifying creatures many had assumed they might be. Instead, they were injured, helpless, and vulnerable. The crowd on the beach grew larger as more people gathered, whispering among themselves about what they should do. Some were still too afraid to get close, unsure whether the creatures posed a threat. Others, though, felt an unexpected pull to help. The scene was almost surreal. The giants were unlike anything anyone had ever seen, yet they were just like anyone in need of assistance. As people looked at them, they saw the same fear in the creature's eyes that anyone would have when trapped or in pain. At first, no one moved. Everyone was waiting for someone else to make the first step. But as time passed, the weight of the situation seemed to sink in. How could they just stand by and do nothing? One woman, her heart pounding, stepped forward. She was unsure of what she was doing, but the sight of the giants struggling in the sand stirred something deep inside her. She reached out cautiously, and with shaking hands, she tried to touch the nearest giant's leg. Her actions were careful and deliberate, as she didn't want to startle the creature, but she also wanted to help. Slowly, others began to follow her lead. It wasn't easy, but they knew they had to act. The giants' struggles weren't stopping, and their groans of discomfort echoed through the beach, making the air feel heavier. It was as if the creatures were calling out for help, and though the humans didn't speak their language, the need was understood. They were trapped, and the villagers, despite their fear, were the only ones who could offer any kind of relief. The first step was to clear the sand around the giants. The villagers worked together, using anything they could find: sticks, rocks, and even their bare hands. It wasn't much, but it was something. The giants remained still as the humans worked, their eyes following every movement, watching as the people carefully pulled away the sand that had trapped them. Their faces were filled with pain, but there was also a flicker of hope in their eyes. It wasn't much, but it was the first sign of help they had received. As the sand began to clear, the giants' bodies started to shift slightly, and they tried to lift themselves, but it was clear they were too weak. The villagers didn't stop. They kept working, moving as quickly as they could to help. The scene was intense, with every minute feeling like an eternity. The beach was alive with activity, the soft sound of the waves now overshadowed by the frantic efforts of the people. Everyone was focused on one thing: getting the giants free. Some of the villagers talked quietly to each other, trying to calm their nerves as they worked. Others just stayed silent, their eyes locked on the giants, determined to do everything they could. It was a strange feeling, helping these massive beings who seemed so alien and unfamiliar. Yet in that moment, they were all united by one thing: the desire to help, to do what was right, no matter how unusual or difficult it seemed. The giants were not monsters. They were not a threat. They were just beings in need, just like anyone else. And with that understanding, the villagers worked together, their collective strength and compassion slowly starting to make a difference. This expanded part 2 adds to the emotional depth of the situation, showing how the villagers step up to help the trapped giants, making the story more engaging and immersive. Let me know if you'd like any changes. As the villagers continued to work together, the atmosphere on the beach shifted. The giants, though still trapped and struggling, seemed to respond to the humans' efforts. Their movements, once slow and agonizing, began to change. The giants' heavy limbs twitched, as if they were trying to find strength in the assistance being given to them. It was a small sign, but it was enough to lift the spirits of everyone working so hard to help. They were no longer just watching helplessly. They were actually making a difference. But then, something unexpected happened. One of the giants, the tallest of them all, let out a soft, haunting sound. It wasn't a growl, nor a roar. It was more like a deep sigh, filled with sadness and longing. The people stopped in their tracks, turning their heads toward the source of the sound. They watched in silence, unsure of what to do next. The giant's eyes, large and glistening, locked onto the faces of those who had come to help. For a moment, everything seemed still. There was no sound except for the faint crash of the waves, and yet the weight of that moment was impossible to ignore. Then, slowly, tears began to trickle from the giant's eyes, running down its pale cheeks like streams of water. The sight of the tears was something none of the villagers had expected. It was hard to fathom that such a massive, powerful creature could cry. The tears shimmered in the fading sunlight, sparkling like diamonds in the sand, and they seemed to carry an emotion that transcended language, culture, and species. The villagers stood frozen, staring at the giant, unsure of how to respond to something so raw and vulnerable. A few of the villagers took hesitant steps forward, their hearts heavy with compassion. Some were moved to tears themselves, seeing the giant's sorrow and feeling an overwhelming urge to do more. The villagers who had been working the hardest, pulling away the sand, stopped what they were doing, struck by the depth of the moment. The sight of the tears made it clear. These giants weren't just trapped in the sand. They were trapped in their own pain, in their own sorrow. The woman who had first dared to step forward moved closer to the giant, her hands trembling slightly. She looked at the tears, and then, slowly, she spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, as if she was afraid to disturb the quiet sadness hanging in the air. "We're here to help," she said, her words barely audible against the sounds of the sea. The giant's eyes, filled with tears, seemed to understand, and though it didn't respond in any way that the villagers could understand, it felt as if a silent agreement had been made. There was a connection, an unspoken bond between the beings, forged in that moment of shared vulnerability. As more villagers came forward, their expressions softened, and they, too, spoke words of comfort. They didn't know what the giants had been through, where they had come from, or why they were here. But in that moment, the tears of the giants told a story of pain and fear, and the villagers couldn't turn away. It was as if the giants had become human in their eyes, just another living being, struggling to survive in a world that was much bigger and more complicated than anyone had ever known. The tears continued to fall, slowly at first, and then in a steady stream. The sight was heartbreaking, and yet, somehow, it was beautiful. It was a reminder that even the most powerful beings could experience sorrow, and that realization changed everything. No longer were the giants just strange, unfamiliar creatures. They were beings in need, and the villagers would not, turn their backs on them. This expanded Part 3 deepens the emotional connection between the villagers and the giants, highlighting the power of empathy and compassion. Let me know if you'd like any changes. The sight of the giants crying and the shared moment of understanding between the humans and the creatures created a powerful shift in the atmosphere. What had started as fear and uncertainty slowly turned into something deeper: compassion. The villagers, who had been so unsure of what to do in the beginning, now found themselves drawn to the giants with a shared sense of responsibility. The giants' tears had touched their hearts, and they couldn't ignore the pain in those large, sorrow-filled eyes. It was as though the giants had become something more than just mythical beings or creatures. They had become symbols of suffering and need, and now the villagers couldn't just walk away. The villagers who had been standing back, unsure of how to approach, now found themselves stepping closer. The fear that once held them in place was replaced by something more powerful: the desire to help. One by one, people moved to the giant's side, gently working to clear more of the sand that held them down. The giants, exhausted from their struggle, didn't resist. Instead, they seemed to welcome the human touch. There was no more hesitation, no more fear of what these massive beings might do. The villagers now saw them as creatures who needed their help, not monsters to be feared. As more of the sand was removed, the giants' movements grew less stiff, less painful. It was clear they were beginning to recover, but it wasn't fast. Every movement seemed to take great effort, and the giants' heavy breaths still echoed in the air. But there was hope now, a glimmer that perhaps they would be able to stand again. The villagers worked steadily, pulling away more of the sand and helping the giants adjust their positions. There was no panic, no urgency to rush. It was as though time had slowed down, and the only thing that mattered was helping the creatures find their freedom. Despite the difficulty, the villagers kept pushing forward. Each time a giant moved slightly, trying to rise, the humans cheered quietly, as though celebrating every small victory. It was an odd scene: humans working alongside creatures so much larger than them, showing kindness and patience. There were no words exchanged. Everything was understood through the careful movements of the villagers, the gentle touch of their hands on the giants, and the hopeful expressions on both sides. A sense of unity started to form on the beach. People from all walks of life, young and old, strong and weak, came together for a common purpose. No one seemed to care who the other was or where they came from. It wasn't about who had the most strength or who had the best ideas. It was about working together, offering whatever help they could, and trusting that, together, they could make a difference. The tears of the giants had shown them a vulnerability that everyone could understand, and that understanding brought the villagers together. With every passing minute, the giants seemed to grow stronger, their eyes less clouded with sorrow. The sand that had once trapped them seemed to slowly lose its grip. The villagers could see the difference in their faces. The giants were no longer just creatures of sadness and pain, but beings who might just have a chance at freedom. The sense of relief in the air was almost tangible as the giants, with the help of the humans, began to shift their weight and slowly rise to their feet. Though they still moved with some difficulty, they were standing. The moment was one of pure triumph, both for the villagers and for the giants. It was a quiet victory, but it was a victory all the same. The beach was no longer just a place of fear and uncertainty. It had become a place of connection, compassion, and hope, where two completely different worlds had come together to help one another. This expanded Part 4 builds on the deepening relationship between the villagers and the giants, showcasing their growing sense of unity and hope. Let me know if you'd like any changes. As the giants slowly stood, there was a collective sigh of relief from the villagers. It wasn't a loud, triumphant noise, but a quiet acknowledgement of the progress made, a shared moment of understanding between them. The giants, though still moving with some caution, were free from the sand that had once held them prisoner. Their large bodies, towering over the humans, were now able to move more freely, and though they were still visibly weakened, there was a noticeable shift in their demeanor. The tears that had once flowed freely had stopped, and the sadness in their eyes had been replaced with something different: gratitude. It was as if, in that moment, they recognized the humans not as strangers or threats, but as allies, as those who had helped them when they were at their lowest. The villagers, too, felt a deep sense of connection. The fear that had lingered in the air when the giants first arrived had now faded. In its place was a feeling of solidarity, an unspoken bond that tied them together. It was hard to explain, but everyone on the beach could feel it. The giants, once seen as strange, towering figures that no one understood, had become something much more. They were living beings, capable of emotion and vulnerability, just like any human. The villagers had helped them, and in return, the giants had shown them something profound: strength not just in their size, but in their ability to show their weaknesses, to trust others in their time of need. As the giants adjusted their positions, testing their strength, the humans watched closely. There was no rush now, no urgency. The villagers knew that the giants were still recovering, and they moved quietly, cautiously, giving them space. The once tense atmosphere on the beach had transformed into something peaceful, even hopeful. It wasn't just the giants who had been freed. It was everyone involved. The villagers had learned something important. Compassion had the power to break through fear, to turn strangers into allies, and to create understanding in the most unexpected of places. A sense of wonder began to grow among the people. How had these giants ended up on the shore? Where had they come from? No one knew for sure, but those questions suddenly seemed less important. What mattered was that they had helped, and that in doing so, they had shared something meaningful. No longer were the giants the center of fear or mystery. They had become part of the story of the people who lived on that beach, part of a moment in time when something larger than themselves had brought them together. One by one, the villagers approached the giants again, but this time with a different purpose. It wasn't to help them escape the sand anymore. Now, it was to offer the giants whatever comfort they could. A hand on the shoulder, a soft word spoken in a language none of them understood, but it didn't matter. The giants looked down at the villagers with an almost thankful expression, their eyes filled with a warmth that made the humans feel as if their efforts had truly made a difference. The sense of connection grew stronger as more people came forward, each person offering something small, whether it was a gentle touch or simply staying close, standing by as the giants regained their strength. The giants, once helpless and weak, now seemed to stand taller, not just because of their physical size, but because they had been given something they hadn't had before: help, care, and a reminder that they weren't alone in this world. The villagers didn't know what would happen next, but they didn't need to. The moment was enough. They had helped these giants, and in return, the giants had shown them the power of empathy and the strength of unity. The beach, once just a quiet stretch of land by the sea, had become a place of shared understanding, a place where beings from two different worlds could come together and stand side by side. And that was a lesson that would stay with everyone for a long time. This expanded Part 5 continues to deepen the connection between the villagers and the giants, focusing on the transformation from fear to understanding and the power of empathy. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments. As the giants stood tall once more, the beach seemed to hum with a new energy. The humans, who had once feared these creatures, now looked up at them with admiration and respect. The sight of the giants, though still slightly unsteady on their feet, was a symbol of perseverance. They had been trapped, vulnerable, and full of sorrow, but now they were free. The villagers couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. Together, they had done something incredible. They had helped these massive beings, and now they were witnessing the result of their combined effort, hope and strength returning to the creatures who had once seemed so unreachable. The giants, though still recovering from their ordeal, began to move more freely. Their steps were tentative at first, as if they were testing their strength. They stood there for a moment, taking in their surroundings, and it was clear that they were no longer in distress. The humans watched quietly, their hearts full of both wonder and relief. No one spoke, but the air was thick with gratitude, both from the giants and the villagers. As the giants shifted, one of them took a slow step forward. It was almost as if they were uncertain of what to do next, unsure of where to go. The humans continued to watch from a safe distance, waiting for a signal, a clue on what to do now. And then, without warning, one of the giants turned its head to the group of villagers and let out a soft, low rumble. It wasn't threatening. Instead, it felt like a thank you, a gesture of acknowledgement for the help they had received. The sound was unlike anything the humans had ever heard, but it held a note of gentleness, of peace. The villagers looked at each other, unsure of what to do next, but there was no fear now. The fear had melted away, replaced by a quiet sense of solidarity. They had helped these creatures when they were at their weakest, and now they had the opportunity to witness the giants in their full strength. It was an extraordinary moment, one that few could have ever imagined before. How often in life did one have the chance to help something so much larger than themselves, to be part of something so monumental? Without speaking, the humans began to gather their things. Some returned to their homes, while others stayed, continuing to observe the giants as they regained their full strength. The giants seemed to pause for a moment, as though they were considering their next move. The humans, having done what they could, now gave the giants the space they needed. There was a deep sense of understanding now between the two groups. Both had offered something valuable to the other, and now it seemed that it was time to part ways. As the giants began to move toward the edge of the beach, the villagers followed from a distance, watching them with awe. They were no longer strangers or beings to be feared. They were something else entirely. They were allies. The giants didn't look back, but the villagers could feel the bond that had formed between them, something that went beyond language or appearance. It was a connection born out of shared experience, born out of the simple act of helping and being helped. For the villagers, this experience would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They had seen something remarkable, something that would change how they viewed the world and the creatures in it. And as they watched the giants disappear into the distance, They knew that this was only the beginning. The lesson of empathy, of reaching out to those in need, would stay with them forever. And in some quiet corner of their hearts, they hoped that the giants, too, would remember the kindness they had been shown on that distant beach. This expanded Part 6 continues the theme of connection, exploring how the villagers and giants part ways after forming a bond, with the story emphasizing the impact of empathy and shared experience. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments. Days passed since the giants had left the beach, but the impact of their visit stayed with the villagers. The beach, once just a quiet place where the waves washed up against the sand, now felt different. It felt like a place where something extraordinary had happened, a place that held a quiet, powerful memory. The villagers continued their daily lives, but their hearts were full. They would never forget the giants, those massive creatures that had shown them the true meaning of compassion and vulnerability. It wasn't just the sight of the giants that had changed the villagers. It was the bond they had shared, the understanding that had passed between them. They had helped when it was needed, and in doing so, they had witnessed the giant's strength in a way no one could have imagined. It was a lesson that had altered the way they looked at the world. The giants had not been some distant, frightening creatures. They were beings just like them, living, breathing, feeling creatures with their own stories, their own pain, and their own need for help. In the weeks that followed, people would often gather near the beach, looking out at the horizon, hoping to catch a glimpse of the giants returning. Though they never did, it wasn't disappointment that filled the hearts of the villagers, but gratitude. They had done what they could in that moment, and that was enough. They knew that the giants had left, not because they were unwelcome, but because they had regained their strength and were ready to move on. The giants had not needed the villagers forever. They had only needed them in that one critical moment. And in that moment, they had shared something that would forever link their lives. The villagers began to talk more openly about what had happened on that beach. They shared the story with their children, with their friends, with anyone who would listen. It wasn't just a story about strange creatures that had appeared from nowhere. It was a story about kindness, about helping when it wasn't easy, about stepping forward when fear would have kept most people back. It became a story that reminded everyone who heard it of the power of empathy, of the strength found in vulnerability, and the importance of offering help to those in need, no matter how different they might seem. It wasn't long before the story spread beyond the village. Travelers passing through would stop and ask about the giants, and the villagers would tell them the tale, each retelling a little more personal than the last. Some of the travelers laughed and shook their heads in disbelief, but others understood. They could see that the story wasn't about giants or monsters. It was about humans coming together to do something good. And it was a story that inspired them to think about their own actions, about how they treated others, about how they could be more kind and helpful to the world around them. Over time, the beach became a quiet place for reflection. People would come, sit, and watch the waves crash against the shore, thinking about the giants and the powerful lesson they had brought. The villagers no longer saw it as just a place by the sea. It was a reminder of something much deeper. It was a place where humanity had shown its greatest strength, not in power or dominance, but in compassion and the willingness to help when needed. Though the giants never returned, the lesson they left behind remained, carried forward in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed that incredible moment. The villagers knew that sometimes the greatest acts of kindness don't require grand gestures. Sometimes all it takes is stepping forward, offering a hand, and understanding that even the most powerful beings have moments of weakness, just like everyone else. This expanded Part 7 reflects on the lasting impact the giants' visit had on the villagers, emphasizing the importance of compassion, kindness, and the enduring lessons learned. Let me know if you'd like any further adjustments. Months passed since the giants had left, but their presence was still felt in the village. The story of the 5 giants washed ashore had become something the villagers would tell for generations. It wasn't just the sight of the giants or the mystery of their arrival that made it unforgettable. It was the connection they had formed with these enormous beings. It was a reminder that no matter how different someone might seem, everyone has moments of weakness, of struggle, and of need. And sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is offer a hand to help them. Life in the village had returned to a sense of normalcy, but the events of that fateful day never truly left anyone's heart. The villagers found themselves more aware of the people around them, more willing to step forward when others were in need. They remembered the giants' tears, how those massive creatures, despite their strength, had shown the vulnerability that made them human in a way. That simple act of showing emotion had shifted everything for the villagers. It made them see that strength wasn't just about physical power, but about the courage to ask for help, to accept it, and to offer it in return. In the months that followed, the villagers began to change. They found themselves helping others more, offering support to those who seemed to be struggling, whether it was someone going through personal hardship or a traveler lost and needing guidance. They started to realize that kindness was not a rare or extraordinary thing. It was something that could be woven into every day, into every interaction. And it wasn't just about helping others. It was about being present, being aware, and showing compassion even when it wasn't easy. The children, especially, had been deeply affected by the giants. They heard the stories from their parents and older relatives, and it became a lesson they carried with them. They were taught that strength wasn't about how big or powerful you were. It was about being willing to show kindness, to reach out to someone else in their time of need. The village's younger generation grew up with a deeper sense of empathy and understanding, always ready to help others, just as the giants had once been helped. The beach, once a place where people came simply to relax, had transformed. It had become a place of reflection, a place where the villagers would come together, quietly remembering the giant's visit. Sometimes, you could find groups of people gathered there, talking softly, sharing stories, and simply appreciating the stillness of the moment. It was a space that held memories of a time when everyone had come together to do something good, to make a difference, no matter how small it seemed at the time. In the years that followed, no one ever saw the giants again. The mysteries of where they had come from or why they had appeared on that particular shore remained unsolved. But the villagers didn't need answers anymore. They had learned everything they needed to know. The giants had left behind more than just memories. They had left behind a legacy of compassion, a lesson in kindness that the village would carry forward forever. As the sun set over the beach, the villagers sat quietly, feeling the weight of what had happened and the power of the lesson that had come with it. It wasn't the giants that had changed the village. It was the villagers themselves, who, by offering help and understanding to creatures they didn't know or understand, had discovered something even more powerful, the ability to change themselves and the world around them, simply by showing kindness when it was needed most. This expanded Part 8 concludes the story, focusing on the lasting impact of the giants' visit and the transformation it brought to the villagers' lives. It emphasizes the power of kindness and empathy in shaping communities. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments.